Saudi Cup, and welcome to another episode here for the Funky Pod, Mindful Media and Communication. Glad you're back with me, and we're talking something, serious again. It's a bit of a theme these days, the last few weeks here on the podcast, but so many serious things are happening, right? And we see right now lots of student protests happening all around the world, mainly in the US, but all over the world there are student protests. And if you were a cynic, you would be like, oh yeah, student protests, the traditional rite of passage where tomorrow's leaders learn the fine art of holding sides and shouting slogans before they get co-opted by the establishment. But we're not cynics here, are we? No. Not at all. Also, students protesting oh, shocking. Next you tell me water's wet and the sky is blue, and it's almost like they care about their future or something. And yes, they do. And the thing is that I asked myself when I thought about this episode, why is it always the students? Why is it only the students, it seems? There must be something to it. Why do we care while we're students? And once we get, as I just said in the intro, get co-opted by the establishment, do we stop caring? Don't we just have the time anymore? Do priorities shift? Or should they shift? Interesting questions. And I found a few answers to those questions, right? And I'm not saying that everybody has to be out there demonstrating all the time. I understand that. I mean, same for me. I'm old now. We have jobs. Maybe we have families, right? That we have to care about. So obviously you don't have as much time as when you are a student. You don't have as much energy as when you were a student. Because when you're a student, you're in your 20s, you're like, yeah, getting up, you're ready to go. And now in your 40s, you're getting up, you're like, oh God, everything hurts. Why am I so tired? Oh God, I don't want to be tired. I go to bed early tonight and tomorrow I'm not going to be tired. Then you go to bed at 9 p.m. and then you're still scrolling through internet, answering emails, messages. Then it's 1 a.m. You finally fall asleep. You wake up at 6 a.m. again and you're like, oh my God, I'm so tired. I can't. And then this is set on repeat. The establishment wants that, by the way, just say, but hey, I'm not Alex Jones, right? But there's still something to it, because even though we're all tired all the time, if we care enough about something, we do it, right? So why aren't we doing more? Why is it always the students that always do something? And there are a few interesting media theories that we can use to actually analyze, why is it as a student, or why is it that students generally do things? And it's not only the protests right now in the US, right? It's right now lots of pro-Palestine protests at US student campus, but also all around the world. In Austria, for example, where I used to live for a long time, there are also student protests, pro-Palestine protests in several universities. Here in Thailand, where I live right now, student protests are a huge thing. Look up the history. It's very intense also. When student protests try to change the government here, for example, try to change the laws. We just had a student protester dying last week, actually, unfortunately. So student protests are a thing all over the world, not only in the US right now. So just to let you know, right? Okay, so now that we got this, let's dive into what makes student protests so powerful, and why is it always students that end up doing what they believe in? I'm not saying the right thing all the time, but why is it that students actually do something? And full disclosure, while I was a student, I also joined protests. So just to let you know from what's my point of view on it. I'm not saying all the protests are good protests. I'm not saying that, but I do say that I understand why students feel like they have to change something. If you were a student, you probably also remember the feeling that you had when you're like, yeah, I'm gonna change the world, damn it. Let's dive into it. The first theory that fits here is from our friend that we discussed before, Jürgen Habermas. Which theory did he posit again? You remember? That's such a teacher thing to say, right? The public sphere theory, a very famous theory when it comes to communication theories. So the public sphere theory. The public sphere is like, you're in a public, where people can see you, where you can interact with like many people in the public. That's the public sphere, okay? That's a space where like individuals can come together, discuss, identify societal problems, for example. And through that discussion, they can influence political action, right? So that's the public sphere. It used to be like the town square, for example, city hall back in the day. Now, of course, it's also social media. It's online forums like Twitter, X, whatever it might be. Okay. Now, student protests, when you look at it, they often serve as like those super vibrant examples of the public sphere in action, because those student protests, they create platforms for discourse that challenge that status quo and that demand change. Right. So it's not just like we just talk about it. It's like, okay, we talked about it for a long time. Now we come together to actually demand action, demand change. And yeah, this is like the next step from just talking about it, so to speak. And this is something that kind of like visualizes what it means to be in a democracy, right? It's democratic participation. And they highlight issues that might otherwise be ignored by what we now call mainstream media, right? And on the examples of now Israel-Palestine, for example, students felt that, hey, maybe the media coverage is like one-sided. Maybe like our universities, they're involved, like in the US, for example, saying like our universities are supporting like Israeli companies, for example, which we don't agree with, and since we are paying the tuition, we make our voices heard now. And yeah, so that's a democratic right. That's why most democracies, they have in the laws the right for protests, right? The right to gather and the right to make your voice heard, as long as it's peaceful, of course. Countries that want to be democracies towards the outside, they don't allow such gatherings, for example. I'm not saying which country I'm thinking of right now. Okay. So the public sphere, right? So where you debate, where you have a discourse, and where you demand change, where you facilitate this demand for change. Like while I'm talking, like I have this picture in my head. When I lived in Austria, there was a huge student protest, like all across all universities. In Austria, I believe, at least like I was living in Vienna, and they shut down all the universities for days, I believe, if I'm not I hope I'm not exaggerating in my head right now, but I think it was for days, maybe even weeks, when they shut down all universities. And you can see just students everywhere, like outside of universities, like on the grass and in the parks and everything. It was an amazing sight to see. And you're like, oh my God, you're so engaged. It's fantastic. And they're making use of the public sphere. Okay, if that wouldn't happen, we wouldn't have been that aware of it. You go to work every day and you're like, they're still there. Oh my God. And so public sphere is a very, very, very powerful theory/tool to actually demand change. Okay, and then you see them, you go to them, you ask them like, hey, why are you still here? What's happening? Then they tell you, then you're like making up your own mind, hopefully. And then you're like, oh yeah, I understand. I support you guys. And maybe you join or whatever that might be, or you support or in whatever form that might be. But the public sphere, very, 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 very crucial element when it comes to demonstrations, protests, and so on, obviously, because it all happens in that public sphere. Okay. One that we didn't talk about, and that's where I'm going to slow down a little bit, is the RMT. Okay, it's called Resource Mobilization Theory. Okay, Resource Mobilization Theory. We didn't talk about this yet on the podcast, so you see, still bringing you some new theories here and there. And the RMT suggests that the success of social movements, including student protests, of course, largely depend on the ability to acquire resources. And for example, money, labor, media attention, and the like. And then effectively mobilize them. Okay, so one more time. Resource mobilization theory, it's in the name, right? Suggests that the success of social movements, such as student protests, heavily depends on the ability to acquire resources such as money, labor, media attention, and so on. So if you can acquire money, labor, people joining, right, and media attention, then you might be successful. If you cannot acquire all those things, and mostly all of those things, if you have lots of people but no media attention, did it really happen, right? So you need to acquire all those things to be successful. So student protests now, they garner support through different ways, such as crowdfunding. So because student organizations usually don't have lots of money unless they're already co-opted by the establishment. Then they might have lots of money, but then they probably cannot, A, they cannot, and B, they don't want to use it for protests, because then that would be against what mostly probably their funding companies would be for, right? So that means student protesters usually rely on crowdfunding. For example, they rely on social media campaigns, and then, of course, also alliances with like other activist groups that might have funding from other sources. All right, so that's usually how you get the money, and this resource mobilization is, of course, like a crucial role when it comes to protests, right? So, for example, like the protests I witnessed in Vienna, for example, they had so many resources in terms of pure people resources, and also then, financial, I'm not really sure about it, but media output or media impact, because it was everywhere. So you heard about it every single day. You woke up in the morning, you're like, okay, go to work, and then, hey, don't forget there's a students' protest, so then maybe like public transport takes a little bit longer, blah, blah, blah. You're like, oh yeah, right. So they got the media attention, okay? Also right now in Germany, like lots of protests against the AfD, the right-wing party, are very much student-led. I mean, of course, lots of other people joining in as well, which is fantastic, but lots of like student organized protests there as well. So that's then when you're like, okay, so mobilization is there. And the prime example right now, of course, all those protests in the US that have, of course, the media impact, because even the big stations report on it. Funding is like a different thing. I'm not really sure about that, but of course they seem to have alliances with like certain groups. So it at least looks like it. And labor in this case, I mean, they have all the students joining in, of course. So that you need to have the resources to actually be successful. And if you only have a good cause but you don't have the resources, no one will hear about it. No one will support you, because it might die down before it even gets any attention. Okay, so it's very, very important. One more time: resource mobilization theory. So only having a good cause, unfortunately, is not enough. That's why protests and demonstrations need to be planned. If you want to study this, look at some of the student protests here in Thailand. They're really good at that. And so check that out. If you like, seriously, if anyone out there is like, oh, it's interesting, you want any case studies, anything, hit me up, funkitpod@gmail.com, funkitpod on social media, or just me personally, LinkedIn, email, whatever. I'm happy to provide more details on like examples that happened here, for example. Okay. Third theory, now a theory that we know already, so I'm going to talk a little bit faster again. Framing theory, you know it, right? You frame certain things in certain ways. So social movements construct and communicate their messages to resonate with broader audiences, right? If you reach a broader audience, you will hopefully get more support. So student protesters now frame their issues to gain sympathy and support from the public and from the media. For example, the climate change. It's like the urgent crisis that we talked about before all the war started. If you remember, we had climate change used to be a thing. Like it impacts future generations. It's gonna cost your children, your children's children. And so that's when then the protesters try to reach like a wider audience to make it, oh yeah, I want to secure the planet for my children's children. They wanted to like justify and amplify student-led climate strikes, for example. Now, if you're looking at like the current situation in the US, again, like I said before, also globally, the protests at all the universities, you would think that now the protesters are saying like, hey, look at the big picture. Do you want to be part of a genocide, for example? Do you support that? Do you really want to be silent and just witness it, right? And then you try to reach a wider audience, like saying that is not correct. You cannot just blindly sit by letting those things happening. You need to do something. And that's like how they try to reach the wider audience and try to frame it in a way that the public goes like, yeah, true. And the thing is, it's nothing new, right? It happened during the Vietnam War, to stick with the US, for example. It happened with lots of other wars and conflicts all over the world. And again, also here in Thailand, for example, the student-led protests, when they want to achieve some change in like the political system, for example. So we see that everywhere. It's not just a US thing, just to make that clear. Okay, now going to slow down again, because actually series number 4 for the day, and again, I'm trying to have 5 per episode these days, so 4 is the CAT, not CTA, CAT, Collective Action Theory. Okay, Collective Action Theory. Okay, cool. So this theory, this addresses the challenges of motivating like individuals, like collective action. So motivating individuals to participate in this collective action when the benefits are shared by everyone, regardless of participation. So it's like, imagine you're like in a student project at uni or at school, right? If everybody gets the same grade, why would you do extra hard work if we all get the same grade, right? The protest is the same thing. If you go really hard in protesting, and I don't mean by hard like shouting and screaming like a lot also, but like if you organize, if you put in your own money, for example, if you spend money to travel to a protest, the outcome for you personally is going to be the same as for someone who doesn't do it. So then why should I do it? And maybe even the outcome might even not even affect you because it's in Palestine, so it doesn't even affect you. Why should I do it if it doesn't affect me? Okay, so that's the collective action theory. So the challenge of motivating individuals, one more time, to participate in an event, in a protest, like when the benefits of the protests, they are shared by everyone or by people somewhere completely different, not even by you that you're participating in it. This leads to the problem of what we then call, also in academia, the free rider problem. When individuals benefit from the outcomes of the work/protests without actively participating. Now, in academia, as a university, we have peer evaluations, we observe teamwork and so on, and then we will still be able to deduct points, for example, and whatnot, right? There's no peer evaluation or protest. Like, hey, all right, we had this protest for like a week now. Time for you to fill out this peer evaluation about your fellow protesters. Did they really protest well enough? There's no such thing, obviously, right? So how do student movements overcome the issue of free riding? And I think they do that by fostering this community of like urgency. That's like, hey, we need to change something now, okay? And what I said earlier, what I said right now, community. So we need to change this right now, and we can only do it if we all stick together. We're all in this together. We're all going to change the world together now. It's important that we all do this together. So you're like, okay, I'm part of a community. In-group, out-group phenomena, we had this once in a podcast. So people want to be part of an in-group. And if you feel like that this in-group, that group that you belong to, does something right, then you're more likely to actually participate and to like really do what it takes to be part of this in-group, okay? So community and urgency. And this then allows the protests, if they use that, to leverage like social pressures. And in this case, maybe positive social pressure. Like, hey, we all gonna be there. So come on, be there tomorrow. Come on, be there tomorrow too. Yeah, I know you have to work, but come on, be there. It's like, oh, okay, I'm gonna be there. Okay, so leveraging it is the social peer pressure kind of thing. Even though, generally speaking, of course, peer pressure, don't pressure anyone into anything, but it's like, I want to be part of this change. I'm part of the community. I cannot let them down, right? So in the positive social pressure, if you will. And of course, then they also use like digital platforms, of course, to lower like participation costs. For example, okay, you have to work, you can't travel there, so you don't have the money, but hey, at least support us online. And I said earlier, like slacktivism and stuff like this, yeah, that's a thing, but better than nothing. And maybe you have an online event, like a live online event, for example, where then people can participate. Right? So it lowers the participation costs, lower barrier of entrance, barrier of engagement, and more engagement overall, of course. So those strategies, they can emphasize the immediate impact of activism on students' lives, futures, and then of course also therefore increases participation, motivates to actually participate. Okay, so that's what we call the collective action theory. Just finding ways to increase this collective action, even though there's no immediate or even no overall positive outcome for you personally there. So then you need to find ways to leverage other ways to make sure that the whole community sees urgency, feels the urgency, wants to participate and wants to move forward with the protest. Okay, collective action theory. Okay. Last theory for this episode, no brainer, but we have to add it because it just makes sense. The network theory, obviously, right? The network theory, and I'm actually not sure if I ever mentioned it before because to me it's such an obvious theory, but we have to mention it. The network theory looks at how digital social networks facilitate the spread of information. And in this regard also, of course, mobilization of movements, right? You spread the information. And with spreading the information, you mobilize movements because you reach more people. So you increase awareness. I hate this word, but the awareness hopefully leads to something more tangible, which is the mobilization of those movements. So student protests use social media platforms to organize, to communicate, and to amplify their messages. For example, here in Thailand also, student protests used a lot of Twitter back then still to organize the protests, for example, a few years back with of course, some coded words also on Twitter so that then the government wouldn't know what it means, for example, but the students all knew the codes and everything. So then they would use social platforms to organize their protests. So, hashtags, of course, still work viral content if something goes viral. If you have student influencers, for example, that goes viral. And online communities, of course, generally are always good to amplify voices, to amplify messages, and they build and, of course, also help, and that's important, sustain protest movements. It's rather easy to get a protest going, easy in exclamation, in quotes, but it's much harder to keep it going, especially for a longer time, right? So sustaining protest movements is really the challenge here, and then the network theory really helps to keep the protests going. So digital networks, social media, whatnot, they help to create this new form of activism, and that transcends geographical boundaries, right? So now the protests in the US aren't just in the US, they're everywhere. Hey, they're doing it. Let's do it too. Let's show support by doing the same thing at our uni tomorrow in Austria and wherever, right? So social media, while we hate on it a lot and we say it leads to selectivism and people don't do much, once there are protests happening, others are jumping in, and students are, as I said through the whole episode now, more likely to do that than others. Okay? All right, I'm not, while I'm wrapping up, I'm not saying go out and protest, but what I do want to say is take some inspiration from those student protests, from the students. As someone who works with students a lot, I obviously can say, of course, student protests aren't perfect. Students have no life experience, not much. What they do have, however, is passion. And sometimes I feel like that us older people who have more life experience and maybe know more in terms of just knowledge, right? That sometimes we're lacking this passion. And if there's a way that we can maybe work together, meet somewhere in the middle, we're sharing some knowledge, what we're trying at university anyways, some knowledge, some life experiences, and so on, and then just get inspired by a little bit of this passion that students still have in them. We're going to make the world a better place for you and for me and the entire human race. Then that can only lead to something positive, to positive change in the world. And if you want to make the world a better place, you finish that. All right, enough with telling you to protest, but I hope that helps to understand a little bit the challenges of student protest, but also why they are succeeding or why there are so many, which is, again, one more time, not a bad thing. Okay. Let me know how you feel about the whole protesting thing. Have you been part of student protests while you were a student? Do you think, no, go back to class and be a good member of society? What are your thoughts on those student protests? At FunkitPod on social media, funkitpod@gmail.com. Like, share, subscribe, leave comments if possible, and ratings, because it really helps to reach a wider audience. And then I don't have to protest to get a wider audience. It would be very nice. Until then, stay safe, take care. Power to whatever cause you're supporting. Until then, Sawadee Khap.